Ancient Gnostics spoke of a transcendent and divine element within humanity. Some called it a seed, others a spark, still others a spirit. They likened it to leaven mixed with dough. We might call it the true self or the divine self. It is the self not made by man. It is uncreated, coming directly from the divine as a gift. At the same time, it has become part of human nature, the human essence. In some systems, only a few people have the divine self activated, in some cases, by a special ritual. In other systems, everyone has this spark, but it must be fanned into flames. For a long time, scholars identified this divine self as a key element of Gnostic spirituality. In this two-part video, I want to discuss the divine self in key Gnostic texts and figures. But prior to that, I want to present the historical background of this idea in ancient lore and literature. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and on this channel, we explore topics from the Greco-Roman world, early Christianity, and Gnostic studies. It's my joy to provide free content, but to do this, I depend on you for support. So please consider joining me on Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by taking one of my many courses like Introducing Marcion, the Hermetica, and Redating the Gospels. Eventually, all my courses will be available to you on a single subscription called the Gnosis Academy. And being part of this special academy involves a monthly hangout with me, so join and introduce yourself to me personally. I want to get to know you. The idea of a divine spark can be traced back to very ancient stories. In the Mesopotamian epic known as Atrahasis, we learn that humankind arises as a substitute for a class of gods who previously labored on earth. This lower class of gods, called Igigi, are forced to build temples and dig canals. Chafing at their toil, the Igigi go on strike and storm the palace of Enlil, the high god. To solve the problem, the gods make humankind. One god, variously named, is chosen for slaughter. His flesh and blood is mixed with the clay that will become humankind. The Igigi also spit upon the clay, offering a kind of second substrate of divine substance. From this mixture of blood, clay, and spittle, humanity is formed. In this way, the spirit or ghost of the slain god, called here a Temu, becomes part of humanity. Humans thus have the god's ability to scheme or plan, called Temu. Whatever the divine in humanity is, it is something that affects or informs their mode of knowing, a mode of knowing that makes humans distinctive. Half a millennia later, in the Enuma Elish, the gods decide to make human beings from the blood of the god Kingu. Kingu had led the forces of Tiamat, and as chief god had ruled the gods allied with her, but he had lost the battle to Marduk. So the winners, led by Marduk, blame him for starting the war and slaughter him to provide recompense. From his blood, the gods Ea and Marduk create the black-headed peoples, or human beings. The ancient account of Babylon by Berosus recounts how Bel, that is Marduk, took off his own head, and the other gods mixed the blood that flowed from his neck with earth to form human beings. And for this reason, Berosus says, humans are rational and have a share of divine wisdom. Phronesios Theos. The variants of this myth are perfectly natural and shouldn't occasion any surprise. If we were to boil down the basic story, it might look something like this. A. Humans are a combination of clay and divine stuff. That divine stuff could be blood, breath, spittle, or any combination. And B. From this divine stuff, human clay is endowed with a special kind of intelligence. And apparently this special quality or intelligence can be passed down through the generations. The key point is that divine substance is essential to making human substance. We see similar stories in ancient Egyptian culture. In the Memphite theology, Atum Ra, or Re, uses the sweat of his body to make other deities. And humanity is said to spring from the tears of joy wept by the Creator when he was reunited with his children. Another tradition has the ram god Khnum make humankind from river clay. Khnum shaped people on his potter's wheel and breathed life into them. He also made a ka, which is a vital force in the form of a double for each person. In Jewish myth, Yahweh breathes a breath of life into the nostrils of the human he formed from clay. Humans are essentially clay animated by divine breath. No other animal is said to get this divine breath, and this breath then must have something to do with human intelligence, since Adam is able to name all the animals. Let's turn to the Greek world. In his famous book, The Greeks and the Irrational, E.R. Dodds searched for the origins of what he called the quote unquote occult self among the Greeks, which he equated with the divine self. He believed that Greeks in the archaic and classical periods had come into contact with shamans north of Greece, ancient Scythia. These shamans could leave their bodies during trances and enhance their powers by receiving the spirits of other beings long dead. It was this insight that the true self is separable from the body that was taken over by Orphic priests on the Greek mainland and Pythagorean philosophers in Italy and Sicily. In Greek thought, the fact that the self is unaffected by bodily death points to its divine nature. The idea of a deathless self made possible the theory of transmigration, at first only applied to great men like Pythagoras, but eventually, to explain the injustices of this world, applied to all people. Momentously, the divine self was eventually equated with the soul, or psyche. In some circles of scholarship, the master narrative used to explain the divine self in Orphic thought is the Zagreus myth. This myth is the final scene of an Orphic theogony, variously told, as of course all myths are. We can pick up the story with Zeus, who reportedly swallowed the ancient firstborn god, later called Phanes, and this allowed Zeus to beget other gods anew. So he fathers Persephone, queen of the underworld, from Demeter, and then has relations with Persephone herself to produce the last and future king, Dionysus. Ever displeased, Zeus's wife Hera incites the Titans, primordial barbarous gods from an earlier epoch, who set upon the child Dionysus, tear him to bits, and devour him raw. In rage, Zeus launches his thunderbolt, instantly blasting the Titans to smoke. Out of their sooty vapor was born the human race. Human nature is thus marked not only by the rebellion and barbarity of the Titan gods, but also by their horrible guilt for their ancient deicide. Yet mixed together with this murky vapor, like glittering sparks, were the remnants of the divine Dionysus. These remnants then come to constitute human nature like flecks of gold in mud. It is these embedded pieces of Godhead that make human nature divine. It is the purpose of Orphic ritual to inform, or rather to remind, the initiate of her true nature, and to provide her the means and power to return to the purely divine Dionysiac state. Although the story of the Titans tearing apart Dionysus is old, possibly as old as the 5th century for the Common Era, the age of the final element, humans are made from bits of Dionysus, has long been disputed. We find this last element in the 6th century CE Neoplatonic commentator Olympiodorus. Although some scholars imply that Olympiodorus teaches a divine soul, Olympiodorus makes clear that it's human bodies that are Dionysiac. He speaks of our Dionysiac bodies in an argument against suicide. In short, that we shouldn't kill our bodies because it's part of Dionysus. This new element of the story carries all the earmarks of Olympiodorus's peculiar interpretation to support his own position. These sorts of additions to the myth are common and acceptable when no canonical version of a story exists. From Orphic myth, we turn to Pythagoras. According to Porphyry of Tyre, Pythagoras philosophized the philosophy whose purpose is to deliver and liberate our descended and separated nous, our higher consciousness, from chains and bonds. In a similar saying, courage is defined as the rescue of the nous held down from infancy, literally tied down from many imprisonments. During his time on earth, Pythagoras rekindled and preserved that which is divine. He anazopuri tathian, kai anasodsdi, in the soul. And he forbade giving birth in a temple because it's not religiously correct there to bind down the divine of the soul into the body. And it became a Pythagorean saying that one must not pull apart the god within oneself, mi diaspantan en heautis thean. Finally, for most Pythagoreans, it was the custom to depart from the body as if from chains. Such traditions would seem to justify the view that Pythagoras is a key and early representative of the divine spark tradition. All of these testimonies, however, come from only two Neoplatonist philosophers writing in late antiquity, Porphyry and Iamblichus. They provide us with two of the three complete surviving biographical accounts of Pythagoras, in which Pythagoras appears much like a Neoplatonic super sage. But there are hints of these traditions in earlier sources, namely Plato, and also Velleius, the Epicurean in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. He states that Pythagoras believed there is a soul stretched out and flowing through all the universe, from which our souls are plucked. Alexander Polyhistor, a contemporary of Caesar Augustus, whom we have secondhand from Diogenes Laertius, offers a more physical explanation of the soul's divinity. He had access to certain Pythagorean records, which date back to the 2nd century before the Common Era. And in these records, the soul is called a fragment of the aether, the apospasma aetheros. Since aether is deathless, the soul is also deathless. And the deathless aether is ever moving, it's pure, it's wholesome. Everything contained in it is deathless and thus divine. The soul has a kinship with the gods through its native heat, and the thinking faculty, here taphronema, is identified as our deathless part of the soul. Diogenes of Apollonia lived slightly before Plato. He affirmed that the air has intellectual power, and as a cosmic force, it steers and controls all beings, and is explicitly identified with God. The soul is heated air, differently modulated in different animals, and even between different people. Air is, furthermore, the power of thought, or noesis, in human beings. It seems likely that this air is what Diogenes called an eternal and immortal body that knows many things. If the air is immortal, it seems likely that Diogenes viewed the soul as deathless as well. According to Theophrastus, Diogenes believed that the air inside human beings is a small portion of God, a mikron marion theou. In his myth of creation, Plato depicted the divine mind as an immortal seed sown within humans by the Creator. This immortal soul is the divinest part of the human being, and it's also the most intimate. The soul is itself a type of God, the higher soul, what Plato calls the most sovereign form of the soul, and calls a daimon or divinity, living as a rheume or synoikon within us. Almost half a millennium later, the Platonist Plutarch called our nous, our higher consciousness, something divine, and he cited approvingly Menander's saying that our nous is the God. But Menander's maxim was itself a recycling of something said by Euripides, that the mind in each one of us is a god. Plutarch wrote a book called The Daimon or Divinity of Socrates, and in this book we hear the story of Timarchus, who, buried in the sacred cave of Trophonius in Greece, spoke with his own divine mind. It told him that part of his mind is not dragged down by the concerns of the soul, but floats like a buoy immediately above his head. This higher self is a divinity or daimon that is released at death and soars above the moon. Aristotle, for his part, also taught the divinity of nous, or our higher mind. In his Protrepticus, he wrote that nous is the God in us, and he regularly defined nous as the human essence. In the Eudemian Ethics, he asks, what is the starting point of motion in the soul? The answer is clear. As in the universe, in the soul, God moves everything. For in some way, the divine element in us is the cause of all our motions. And the starting point of reason isn't reason, but something superior to reason. What then could be superior even to knowledge and to intellect, except God? Zeno of Citium was head of the Stoic school, and he taught that humans have in themselves, as it were, a god. Following Plato, Chrysippus called this internal god a daimon or divinity. And this thought was developed by a later Stoic, Posidonius, who wrote that the cause of our emotions, of discord, and of our unhappy life is the fact that we don't follow our own inner daimon, which is akin and has a similar nature to the God who governs the universe. Posidonius's daimon within, which we must follow, is moral intelligence. It's the rational ruling aspect of our minds. And by Stoic natural philosophy, this daimonic aspect of our mind is actually a concentration of the active and creative rational principle that directs the universe, which is physically immanent throughout it. In a similar vein, Cicero wrote in his Dream of Scipio, quote, "Be sure that it's not you that is mortal, but only your body. For that one whom your outward form reveals isn't yourself. The mind is the true self, not that physical figure which can be pointed out with the finger. Know then that you are a god, deum te igitur scito essa. If a god is that which lives and feels, remembers, foresees, rules, governs, and moves the body over which it is set, just as the supreme God above us rules the universe." Unquote. In his Tusculan disputations, Cicero made clear that according to Aristotle, it is the mind, drawn from the fifth essence, that reflects and foresees and learns and teaches, makes discoveries and remembers. Therefore, our nous, here using the Latin word animus, is divine. And this is said to be the meaning of the Delphic maxim, know your nous. For the one who knows oneself will realize in the first place that one has a divine element within, and will think of this inner nature as a kind of consecrated image of God. In other words, the mind should know its own self and feel its union with the divine mind, from which insatiable joy is fulfilled. Speaking as a poet, but perhaps also as a philosopher, Ovid sang that there is a God in us, est Deus in nobis, and when he stirs, we grow warm, and this impulse holds the seeds of a sanctified mind. Manilius, a poet in the era of Tiberius, wrote that into human beings alone God has come and dwells and seeks himself in humanity's seeking of him. Can one doubt, he asks, that God dwells within our hearts and that our souls return to heaven whence they came? Seneca, who was a Stoic in the age of Nero, wrote to his friend Lucilius, probably fictional, that the upright mind, or animus rectus, is nothing other than a God dwelling in a human body, a deum in corpore humano. Having a God within allows people to leap to heaven. And in a later letter, he asks, do you wonder that a human being goes to the gods? God comes to human beings. Or to say it more properly, he comes into human beings. Divine seeds, semina divina, are dispersed in human bodies. It's a good farmer who receives them, and they spring up similar to their source and rise equal to those from whom they arose. But the most famous passage describing the Senecan God within comes in Epistle 41. Quote, "You are doing what is best and salvific for yourself if, as you write, you persist in attaining a good mind. It is foolish to pray for this when you can acquire it from yourself. Lift not your hands to heaven, nor beg the keeper of the temple that he admit us to the ear of the cult statue, as if you would be better heard. No, God is near you, with you, in you. I mean this, Lucilius. A sacred spirit dwells in us, the observer and guardian of our evil and good deeds." In the following century, the Stoic Epictetus says that Zeus has presented to each person a divinity or daimon as a guardian and has committed his safekeeping to this trustee. Remember to never say that you are alone, because you are not. God is within you, and your own divinity is within. Epictetus calls human souls the portions and fragments of God. And in the next generation, Marcus Aurelius refers to the mind of each person as a God that has flowed down from the supreme deity. Elsewhere, he speaks of the God in you, which is the daimon in you. And the daimon, or nous, is a fragment of God. It's part of our proper nature, and by it we have the capacity to understand the rational organization of the world in which we live. The highest task of a human being is the correct care of this divinity, keeping it untroubled, undamaged, and pure. Finally, it's a general opinion, says Plotinus in the mid-3rd century, that the God in each human being is one and the same. And Plotinus writes specifically, quote, if soul sometimes reasons about the right and good and sometimes doesn't, there must be in us a nous, which does not reason discursively, but always possesses the right, and there must be also the principle and cause and God of nous. He is not divided, but abides. He is contemplated in many beings, in each and every one of those capable of receiving him as another self, and alon auton. According to Eustochius, who was Plotinus's doctor, the last words of Plotinus were, try to bring back the God in you, tan enumin theon, to the divine in the all. And Plotinus's disciple Porphyry wrote to his wife Marcella that the temple of reason has been firmly established only in the thought of the wise person. A shrine must be adorned for him because of wisdom in his heart. A shrine with a living statue, the nous, for God imparts his form to the one who honors him. And so Porphyry wrote, let the nous within you be a temple of God. Remembering God as overseer of one's plans and practices effectively makes God a roommate, a synoikon within your soul. And in the Hermetic literature, Hermes instructs his disciple taught in the 12th treatise, the nous is from the very essence of God, if indeed there is an essence of God. Our nous is not something cut off from the essentiality of God. It is rather like something spread out from God, like light from the sun. In this way, the nous in human beings is a God. And so some people are gods, and humanity itself is close to divinity. Above all, humanity is deathless and can also receive God and share God's essence. Accordingly, the idea of a divine spark or self is not a distinctly Gnostic idea. It's in fact an extremely ancient human idea with an excellent philosophical pedigree. Nevertheless, the Gnostics developed this idea in their own distinctive way, and how they did so, we will cover in the next episode.